the start of 2012, I was what was called an associate tutor at the University of Sussex. And I was trying to bring in my research on Black and South Asian artists in the 80s into my teaching as much as I could. Came to the realization, probably a bit late, that I needed to make a change. I applied and got a new job based at Tate Britain, working as the Henry Moore Foundation Research Fellow, cataloguing the Tate's Henry Moore sculpture collection.
More works and works on paper in here as well, but the art collection, and then the social history collection as well. So.
Yayoi Kusama at Tate Modern is the blockbuster exhibition of 2012 that for me signals a moment. The exhibition notes on the Tate website are an interesting testament to where we were at the time. The notes are informative, respectful, yet subtly othering. Again, it feels like we're on the cusp of something. Terminology such as neurodivergent is still not fully embraced in art establishment showing spaces. But that from my perspective, the middle and later years of this decade is when neurodivergence really begins to break through. And I think I began an artist page on Facebook in 2012 or thereabouts. And that was an important way of connecting. There was also the AN blogging platform at that point. And I also used WordPress. And at that point, my identity really was as a mother of a neurodivergent child, and I had been doing a lot of research from that perspective. And then it was later on that, having found community, I began to realise and unpick my own identity.
Yeah, I actually consulted my diaries, which I thought would be quite an interesting way of thinking about 2012, and I did lots of interesting things. But it's probably about the last time I sort of travelled. I travelled a bit to Vancouver and Cologne and places, and I don't think I've been on an aeroplane since. So that says something about how climate change has impacted on my ethical position. But I do think that for me, in a sense, 2008 was probably more of a watershed sort of moment, because there was the economic crash and there was the Occupy movement and all these sort of things, and I think they were still having resonances 4 years later. I've sort of thought about this, looking at our programme and thinking about the things that I was doing, because I was then artistic director of the whole centre with a very good curator called Sarah Jane Parsons, who was bringing in some really interesting shows. But I think in 2008 we were sort of protected in a sense from the crash because we'd just opened. 4 years later, the funding cuts were really starting to hit, because we were protected for a couple of years with an enhanced outcomes of funding, which then stopped. So we had to, just curtail some of our programs, which were going very well. That one, difference on display, which became Neat Normal. That I've got over there, Human Craft, that's the Gina Zarnecki. And we could talk about that perhaps in relation to some of the what's been happening with quarantine and infection, viruses.
But it was a definite commission for Channel 4 telly. It's a very corny idea in many respects. It's a discus, somebody throwing a discus, which was based on Myron's Greek sculpture called Discobolus. So I wanted it to relate to the original Olympic Games, so right back in history. And then this is the ubiquitous wheelchair logo. Of course, only something like 5% of disabled people use wheelchairs. But this logo, this very simple stick logo, is everywhere in the world. It's instantly recognisable, even though it doesn't really represent disabled people. We're not a homogenous group. So I wanted to use that in a kind of signifying way. This is the real thing. Whilst the sculpture was very overt, the title of the sculpture, which titles are really quite important for me, is The Monument to the Unintended Performer, was kind of a quite subversive, in that disabled people are always stared at, just going about our everyday business. You know, if somebody in a wheelchair gets on a bus, everybody stares. So we are unintended performers in that sense. And yet the Paralympians want people to stare at them. You know, they want to be objects of scrutiny. So I wanted to play around with that paradox of staring, not staring, being watched, not being watched, which is what the title was about. So some disabled people got that instantly.
2012 I certainly remember as quite a transitional year. I remember it as a year of a lot of flux. There was a lot going on. I just left Tate in 2011, and I was teaching at the Architectural Association, and I also joined the Royal College of Art, the Curating Contemporary Art programme, in the summer of 2012. But I just remember also the background context. I know we're thinking about 2012, but 2011 just bled into 2012. There was Occupy movement, of course, going on in London at St Paul's. There was Liberate Tate over at Tate Modern. There were student protests about the student loan arrangements, which really were, I think, quite a wake-up call for everyone. So I just remember, and there were riots, there were things happening in Brixton in my local area. So there was a lot going on in the background, I remember. 2012, I think for a lot of people, the exhibition that one would remember was Documenta. Been a lot of focus on this particular Documenta, which was curated by Caroline Christoph-Bakafiev, and it had really picked up on the questions and conditions of global unrest and protests that had happened the previous year. So it really had that sense of urgency about the kind of political conflicts that were happening, moment that happened outside the Friedrichshain. And it was interesting that was dealt with by the curatorial team, that it was, rather than evicted or challenged, it was absorbed into the programme. In the same way that when Liberate Tate took over Turbine Hall, you know, these were moments of confrontation that needed real engagement with, to be taken seriously, not just to be managed.
Late 2011, a show that was co-curated by Paul Goodwin and Labaina Hamid opened, called Thin Black Lines. So that ran from late 2011 to March 2012. And that show re-examined Labaina Hamid's curatorial work from the 1980s. And it included the work of black women artists, including Claudette Johnson, Shutapa Biswas, Sonia Boué, Labaina Hamid, and others. And as well as a whole array of archival material. So that was a really significant thing that happened at the start of 2012, perhaps to coincide with that show. The exhibition Migrations, Journeys Through British Art opened at Tate Britain. That show was all about how artists who had migrated to Britain or who came from diasporic communities in Britain had shaped and contributed to a narrative of British art. And so it was a historic show, and it had artists from the 19th century up to the 21st. But it was really important because it included works by artists active in the 1980s, including Donald Rodney and Eddie Chambers and Keith Piper, Joanna Comfra. And so it was really significant to me to see that this institution called Tate Britain was engaging with the notions of who might be included in a narrative of British art and who might be identified as a British artist.
And then I think the other show, which I think put down a sort of marker, which I think is still very important in relation to the last decade that we've gone through, was the biennial, and the theme of that year was, which was curated by Sally Tallant, was it's called The Unexpected Guest. And I'll just read a little bit from the brochure, because I think this is quite interesting. It says, in a globalising world, increasing mobility and interdependence are changing the rules of hospitality. There are different cultures of hospitality, often coexistent in the same place. Our awareness of such complexity and migration between nations and cultures makes clear distinctions between host and guest increasingly difficult. And haven't we just had that in the last sort of 10 years in terms of migrations and welcoming or not welcoming people, hospitality. So it was a sort of prescient theme. And at the Blue Coat, although it wasn't done, this what we had was not done specifically for the biennial, but the main piece was John O'Confra's Unfinished Conversation, which was a 3-screen film piece.
Professor Stuart Hall and myself have been working together for a very long time. But in about 2002, 10 years before the actual first displaying of it, I met with my colleague at the time, Derek Bishton, and Catherine Hall, Stuart's partner and wife, and Stuart in a cafe in Camden. And we were discussing this idea of how would we begin to tell his story and his engagement with the visual arts, but not as a kind of straight story, if you like, not as a linear story, but as someone who drifted in and out of communications and visual studies and semiotics and an incredible, academic cultural studies life, which of course was the essence of what Stuart was about. He was someone that understood the power of popular culture, understood the power of images, and we discussed the possibility then of making a multi-channeled visual narrative that gave Stuart the opportunity to unpack over a period of time his thoughts. So it was really about the thoughts of Stuart Hall, but through the idea of film, but make something that was incredibly accessible, so that ideas about race and rights and identity politics could be unpacked, but predominantly through the lens of his own experience. That was the idea of this journey. John O'Confra had a very sympathetic kind of lens on Stuart's life and work as well. And I think he was probably also thinking about the impact of Stuart's world on his work. And we kind of came together to make what was always going to be a 3-screen, multi-channeled, galleried piece. It was never really meant for television. Bryan had agreed that he would support that application, knowing the work of Autograph over many years, knowing the work of John O'Confra over many years. Bryan, as the director of the Blue Coat Gallery at the time, said, "I'm happy to support the making of this, I get it." And that was quite radical in many ways for him to offer that support. And they negotiated the work being part of or being shown in the Biennale. I think it was a gift to the Biennale from my perspective. I think they did very well. It became central, seminal. It created an excitement. It was clearly, of its time, a really important piece of work. It still is. I think it's still on a show at Tate as we speak now. And it hit a chord.
And I think the Tate Tanks opening in 2012 was an opportunity that Tate did take up. I think it was a 12 or 15 week program called Art in Action, and that really tried to follow visitors and audiences. There were a mixture of programs. There was a move to performance, much more use of digital technology, events, rather than any object-based conventional modernist staging. And I think Chris Durkin, the then director at Tate Modern, in press releases and I think in interviews, he started to say, the new museum in the 21st century needs to be thought of as a medium. I think it's very hard for a museum structure formed in the 19th century, however much it's changed, to recognise its function as one of just mediating rather than broadcasting.
So we were encouraged to put in a funding application with Shape as the lead partner, Arts Admin as the production side of things, And we invited Joe Verrington as our to act as senior producer. And it was very democratic how we did everything, all the decision making. We brought together a group of people to evaluate and vote on each of the commissions. And what we wanted was for the majority of that money from the Arts Council, the British Council and the Spirit of 2012 and LOCOG to go directly to funding the artists and their production of their work. So that was a great piece of legacy. And Shape has managed Unlimited for the next sort of 10 years, and now it's sailed off as a fully formed and hopefully, wonderfully established commissioning process, which will continue.
I think these ones belong in this box. I think it's possible to talk about the Museum of Everything exhibition in Selfridges 2011 as being on the coattails of our decade, and the Project Artworks States and Spaces exhibition at the Milton Keynes Gallery just overlapping by a few days into 2012 as a tipping over at the cusp of something new. I first started going on Twitter to research an artist, funnily enough. And I came across an artist called John Adams. From May 2012 until June 2013, John Adams held a post as the artist in residence at the Autism Research Centre at the University of Cambridge. And I was absolutely fascinated. And at that point, I wasn't diagnosed. And he also had made works around his school experiences of dyslexia. And I remember in particular seeing an exhibition with all these objects that he'd kept in cabinets and a pen which he'd put pins into relating to his experience with writing and dyslexia. And that was like, oh, wow. That was a real light bulb moment for me. And John's example was very important to me, but I think he was probably the only person that I knew of at that point who was practicing in this way. Whereas now you will see many people, in fact, there's so many, I've lost count.
I think what the archive wants to do is to highlight work that we think is important work. And then the institutions like Tate or the National Gallery or whoever it is can look at that work and see it in the National Archive. And then the curators can look and think, okay, that's interesting work. Because often they won't understand some of the stories behind the work. And that's part of the issue for curators, isn't it? Understanding the nature of the work. When we look at marginalised groups or discrimination in Britain, the archive becomes a really important place to look.
But I think that's an excellent question about what happens to this work. And I do have physical work. I do have work that's been shown in real life. I do have work that, has been sold and acquired. But it's rare that happens. And since the pandemic, I'm far more interested in developing online. And I think these things do need to be collected and archived.
We are living in a culture that outside of our institutions is extremely interdisciplinary, if not transdisciplinary. Culture is not being formed in the same spaces and places as the 1890s. And the art school, the university system, and the museum are not reflecting how knowledge is being made outside of them. It's chasing. It's a big ask for institutions, and particularly museums, to value audiences equivalent to or more than its collection. And because of the way museums think about their audiences and segmentation and a kind of hierarchy of needs still, it's still like high art, low art. There's still an invisible, hidden assumption that there are categories of what is art and what is not art. And that's such a collapsed category And in a way, does it matter if it, you know, outside of the acquisition pool, you know, what matters is whether the museum is still a place of relevance and significance, you know, in the here and now. Of course, it has a duty to protect what it has acquired with the nation's money on behalf of the nation. But if the nation is changing, you know, and it's also about future nation, then understanding what the nation is and wants, and including its representation in the dynamics, you know, has to happen. And I think, you know, just on the final thing of that, you know, I think it was, you know, it was Boris Groys who said, you know, and I think the museum hasn't quite recognised this, you know, the internet has rendered the museum as the archive, you know, because now the internet, you know, is the collector. And I think that leaves the museum in a very uncertain place. But I believe in the museum, and I care passionately about the art museum, but I think it can afford to take so many more risks and have confidence to critically reflect with others.
But I suppose what's always encouraged me has been, you know, as somebody who's worked in the regions all my working career, is the value of nurturing a local scene. And the word local is always problematic. You know, it always seemed to be second class. You know, local is very parochial, provincial. I think that changed. I think it's changed a lot over the last 10 years, partly because of digital, because artists can now move quite easily between continents because they just do it digitally. And also I think there's more that sense of the sort of solidarity of that practice, that the issues that we've been, you know, looking at in terms of Black Lives Matter or those inclusion issues, they're not UK, they're international issues. And so I think there's much more of that sort of sense of solidarity amongst artists, and there's, you know, really interesting networks that happen. And often the galleries aren't part of that. They don't need to be part of it because there's an ecology that exists outside of that, which I think is healthy.